Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. We are live right here on CannaBuzz. We're stoked to have you guys here. It's October 19th, live on CannaBuzz. If you're watching this in the future on YouTube, what's up, everyone on YouTube? Thanks for subscribing to CannaBuzz on YouTube and giving us some love over there. We appreciate it. Also want to shout out everyone who is a subscriber and supporter of CannaBuzz in our community. You can become a paid supporter. Use code 420summer. It's still summer here, I guess. So put in that code and you can get a discount on our membership. But we are joined today by Rebecca, otherwise known as That Cannabis Writer. And I'm super excited to connect with you, Rebecca. How are you doing tonight?
I am fantastic. So excited to connect with you as well.
Awesome. And Rebecca, how about I could try to introduce you a little bit in terms of your background, but I don't want to gloss over anything. So how would you, describe your career in the cannabis industry and what you're up to these days?
Sure. So I am mainly a writer now, freelance writer in the cannabis space and former budtender, and I also do brand ambassador work. So that's kind of my main spiel in the cannabis space right now, as well as content creation and, just doing fun stuff on the internet. So that's kind of my vibe right now. As far as getting started in the cannabis industry, and that's I'm a lifelong stoner, I guess. I'm very comfortable with that title. It is a term that is near and dear to my heart, and I wear it proudly. So I always come from the perspective of a cannabis consumer, and that kind of intersected with my love for writing. And I got kind of my start at Cal State East Bay. That's where I went to school, and I ended up in a journalism class just because I had a little bit of curiosity and very limited options for my elective that quarter. So it worked out because my professor was like, write about what's going on in the community and write about something you love. And it was 2018 and cannabis had just became recreational in California. So there was a lot to write about and to happening in the community and in the space. So I just started writing, and I've kind of continued that, and I continue to write for different publications. And then I recently ended my 2.5, almost 3-year long career as a budtender in the Bay Area as well. And that was a lot of fun, a lot of learning.
Yeah, I came across you because you create content on Instagram and the different platforms. And, one of the things that you post on your Instagram stories and stuff like that is just stories of being a bud tender and stuff like that. So we'll talk about that a bit later because I'm sure there's people in our community that would be interested in becoming a bud tender, but then also, as consumers, we also have our critiques of bud tenders. So I'm really curious on your perspective and that experience. But before we jump into that, we'll talk about the journalism and the writing stuff that you've done. So yeah, you have done some stories as a cannabis journalist, right? You've written some stories over the last couple of years or so. Could you tell us a little bit about that? What kind of things have you put out there that maybe people could look up and check out some of your work?
Sure. So some of my most recent stuff is with Nug. They have a subscription service, as well as a kind of an education based blog platform, and that's been really fun for me. And I cover a lot of 101 topics. A lot of one of my recent topics that I'm working on is cannabis and sperm, right? Just general questions that people have about weed and how it affects their life and how to start infusing their life with cannabis. So I do a lot of 101 pieces, but I also I love doing interviews. So I recently did an interview with the CEO of Fume, which is a Napa based cannabis brand, and just talked to him about kind of his journey with transitioning from wine to weed. So those are fun ones that I do. And I think it's always hard for me to remember everything because I'm
Yeah,
writing. But
totally.
oh, and then I do a more of like a column style with Hello Bliss, where I can be like really honest and open and curse and be myself, and I do product reviews there, as well as just just it's called the Cannabis Journal because it's kind of it narrates kind of my life and my experience with cannabis and how I infuse different products into my life.
Very cool.
Well,
Very cool.
with being a journalist in the cannabis space, it's not like there's like an AP wire where you can just go and get stories and information from. Do you have to like really work within your local community, or how do you find good source material to write on?
It's definitely being in tune with the community, especially in the Bay Area. I think that's where journalists, especially cannabis journalists, get a lot of their competitive edge as far as stories go, and really being a part. It kind of helps to be a consumer as well because I know where kind of to see marketing fluff, versus like actual factual storytelling. So I definitely use my community, and you'd be surprised, there is a lot of great cannabis resources out there, but it does take more digging. I'm definitely spending more time researching than writing a lot of the time to verify what is fact and what someone has kind of taken, because a lot of times you hear like weed cures COVID, and that's a very broad thing that was like, okay,
Right.
like it was easy to kind of put that on a headline, but diving deeper into that topic and reading more into that research are kind of like, okay, like it may affect one molecule of the COVID. I didn't get into that one, but that's
Yeah,
kind of like
yeah.
the general consensus. You definitely have to like dig deeper because it's so easy to say cannabis cures everything, but research is tricky, right? Because sometimes it's not always on humans, sometimes it's not on cannabis as a whole, sometimes it's on one terpene and not a whole cultivar. So it's definitely doing due diligence into the full story.
Yeah, there's a lot more nuance, and all that usually gets lost, especially in like cannabis, where a lot of things are just spread through like screenshots of headlines and then posted to your like IG feed. So it's like people will just see a headline and then that's like their whole take, on what happened, So yeah, I can definitely see that. Um, so being a cannabis writer, what's that like these days? We're in California here. We've been legalized for like 4 years or so. We've been recreationally legal, medical, much longer than that. But anyways, we've had a bit of a cannabis industry going on for a little while. What's it like being a cannabis writer out there? Is it tough to find gigs? Is there more kind of stuff available? Like, yeah, what's that like?
I've been very blessed to have brands reach out to me and need help with stuff like blog work. I always say that the cannabis space, even though we're fresh in California, it's only been 4 years, it's still very new, and there's still, and I learned this in my time as a bud tender, there are people that are still very intro level, and walking into a dispensary is scary. And even like, I mean, the shift from I'm never going to smoke weed to I might try it because I need help sleeping is still very much happening. So I have been blessed to have a lot of opportunity with whether that be with brands or with news publications. There's a lot of publications that have, especially in California, that have now started to have like specifically just for cannabis because there's so much happening, whether it be with product or regulation, or I mean, we heard the news, last week with like, okay, like, are they gonna, decriminalize it? Are they gonna, he's gonna release all these prisoners, and then after a couple of days, we kind of realize, okay, that doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah.
So there's lots happening at all times that needs to be broken down into smaller, more digestible pieces for the everyday consumer. So there is a lot of work out there. I think it's harder because there are cannabis journalists that have been doing it for a while, but definitely I haven't ran into struggles, finding opportunity. It's just about pitching the right story, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's
And
cool. I'm glad to hear that there is opportunity out there because I know being a journalist isn't easy, being a writer isn't easy. And so I was curious, yeah, what that kind of field is like. But go ahead, JR.
I was just gonna say, when you get across topics like you had mentioned with, the difference between pardons and expungement and what that really means, is it hard for you to walk a kind of political line whenever you're trying to present the story or the facts?
Yes. I mean, yes and no. I try to be as, because I have, I have a little bit of education in journalism and kind of like the ethics behind that. I try to be as unbiased and, as subjective as possible, but I have learned that bias is just in all of us naturally. So I think I do my best, but I also tend to not, because I don't have a lot of expertise in political science specifically, I try not to talk too much on those topics if I don't have to. I tend to focus more of my work in education and product and more culture necessarily than the politics. Because I did dabble a little bit in like speaking to politicians and stuff, and it is very overwhelming, especially with how rapidly it changes. So there are publications and resources that I kind of use. Supernova Women is one of my favorite sources for breaking down, legislation that's happening right now. I do tend to look towards the Last Prisoners Project for breaking down any sort of information. They did a really good job of breaking down what all that, news meant for us. So yeah, that's where my kind of expertise lies. But I try to be as unbiased as possible because I know better.
Let's see. So for folks that might be writers or aspiring writers, do you have any suggestions for those folks that might want to do writing in the cannabis space in, whatever form that may take?
Yeah, I mean, I think I say we're all writers, period, right? I don't think that because anybody can be an expertise on a topic and put words to paper. Some of us just have like more of a knack for it. But I started just writing on Medium. Like I had when transitioning out of college and trying to build a clientele list, I just had Medium, and it's kind of like YouTube for writers. You can really write about anything and you can potentially get paid, not a lot, but it's a place to put your thoughts and to get feedback on your thoughts. And cannabis is it's a topic that you could talk about forever. So there's a lot of people interested in, I think one of my most popular ones on there was cannabis and grief. And I just kind of wrote about what I had learned, going through a grieving process of losing a loved one and, endings of relationships. And it's still one of my most read pieces, as well as I did a really quick review on a Yummy Karma tincture, and people still read that. So that was really where I kind of started to get comfortable writing about cannabis. But then I also used Instagram and social media in general. I took a class called Personal Branding Accelerator, and they really kind of emphasize using your captions as a space to write. And Instagram still is a place where people will read captions. So, as long as somebody has the will and the passion to do so, there's a lot of places to just start where you necessarily won't make a ton of money, but you can at least develop an audience. And an audience is, big or small, is a great thing to have if you want to be a writer.
I hear that. Well, shout out to everyone in our live chat real quick. We had some comments from people that are watching and everyone. So shout out to everyone. We'll take live questions a little bit later on. So if people want to like pepper in some questions or anything like that, I'll try to keep track of that. One of them asked if you grow any cannabis, if you grow your own weed.
Oh, I will have to say I haven't dabbled in the grow process yet. And it is one of, that cultivation is a beast of its own. And I have a lot of respect for growers and anybody that's worked in cultivation or anywhere in that department. It's a vital part of this industry. But I don't really have a green thumb, so like people say succulents are really easy to keep alive, and I can't keep one of those alive. So I haven't had the means or the time to dabble in home grow, but I do believe that home grow is going to be the future with the way that cannabis is right now. I think people growing their own stuff, it's going to be like how everyone started growing their own vegetables during the pandemic. You just realize like, it's not that hard.
Yeah, right. Do you
Especially
have
with
an
the advent of smart pots and self-watering pots. It
What was
makes
that?
they have what are called smart pots or self-watering pots. So it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. You just kind of put your soil in, you plant your plant, and just make sure the water stays full and it feeds or it waters it for you.
Yeah, there's a brand called a Pot for Pot, and they give you like all the 101s of it, and yeah, they make it really easy. So I'll have to try it soon for sure, just to see if I can, you know?
yeah. So you're out here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm here as well. And so I'm sure you've kind of met or seen brands or growers or just even dispensary chains or whatever you want to call it, that you think are great or that you really respect or want to shout out. What are some, do you have any sort of like of those that you want to shout out or come to mind as terms of like things that you brands that you really respect or companies or growers that you really respect? And then I'd be curious, I guess, like why do those come to mind when I ask you that question?
Yeah, as a former budtender, I have a lot of strong opinions on brands, and especially, I always tell people it's like because I have been in the Bay Area my whole life, I've been blessed with a lot of access to variety, and I've seen a lot of brands come and go. I think okay, so definitely off top, I love Space Gems. Space Gems is a solventless gummy, woman owned, made out in Oakland. They're freaking delicious, and they hit which are the two of the most important things when it comes to like cannabis products. And I just have a lot of respect for Wendy and her hustle. So that one's just a brand that I love and respect. I always, oh man, see now I get like all like nervous when I think about it. You know which brand I've been loving their flower apps, and I've been blessed to try some of it? It's Fig Farms. They've been producing some really beautiful flower. That's a brand that I'm like, okay, I will pay money for that one. That's some good stuff.
Yeah.
I work with Coastal Sun, and Coastal Sun has been my favorite even before I worked with Coastal Sun. They're just a brand that's really easy to get behind as far as like, values and really connecting with the customers. They've always done a really good job of making sure that customers are, the most important. Let's see, what other brands have I really been digging? CannaMunch is a new brand, Latina owned, I believe, and they are microdose edibles, live resin, but also vegan. I love vegan gummy, Rose Delights, they're a great LA-based brand. They make rosin edibles, and not a lot of people are doing rosin with their edibles. So, and that they also, I love Rose Delights. They are actually making their edibles in a really small kitchen based out of San Francisco. And their process of making rosin is so intimate. And I don't know if anybody's ever just like got stoned and like YouTubed rosin press. It's just such a beautiful process.
Totally.
So I love them as well. Trying to think who else I've been really like. It's kind of hard because there are brands that like I dig and like I'm like, oh, okay, those are cool brands, but there are very few brands that like I ride or die for that I'm like
Yeah.
every time I get it, like I every time I'm in a shop, like I have to get it.
Right.
So I have a question for you. Pre-cookie era, what were some of the cultivars in the Bay Area that were some of your favorites?
Some of the cultivars, I've always been a wedding cake kind of gal. That's always been one. But to be quite honest, like before I started working, in cannabis, I didn't really pay attention, like I do now. And that's kind of like where I always come from the consumer's perspective. Is like some people genuinely like you think they're paying attention to like the strain names, but most of them are just kind of like buying and like shopping in that very moment and will forget by the time they come back. And so that was kind of my vibe, before then as well. I mean, there was like Alien OG was a one that I absolutely loved for a really long time. And that was actually grown by Kaliva. And that was like one of my absolute favorite, cultivars from them. Wedding Cake, Alien OG were two that always like did the job for me. So those were some of my favorites.
So you like the heavy hitters?
I used to be like just those heavy body feelings. But Alien OG is interesting to me because after I learned a little bit more about it, it actually tends to be really rich in limonene, which is a terpene that can be very like uplifting, which made sense to me. I was like, oh, it makes sense because I used to start my day with it. Everyone would be like, oh, like Alien OG is too heavy, but I liked it because I was still able to function. I always called it like a functional like stoner high, you know, because
Yeah.
people that smoke a lot need that like heavy body feel, which tends to be in the cultivars that are categorized as indicas. But yeah, that's when those terps kind of come into play, and you can really kind of find different ones that, you know, achieve different effects.
Yeah, I'm a grower and I kind of gravitate towards that profile where you get that heavy stone, but you still have enough euphoricness that it kind of gets you going. And I'm kind of the same way.
Yeah, it's the best way to be high, to get that initial like burst and you're like, oh, okay, like this feels good. I feel happy. I feel euphoric, right? That's a word that people use a lot. And I kind of had to break down what that means because they use it in a lot of different cultivars, but it's just a genuine like kind of like sense of uplifted and happiness. And to have that in a cultivar that then like really mellows out and you're like, okay, like I can chill and I'm happy, and you know, my pain and or anxiety is kind of taken care of for a minute, you know, I think is a beautiful thing.
So are you flower or dab?
I am more of a flower girl, and I did get myself a Puffco though, and because I have an actual like rig and I have a torch. I just haven't gotten around to like doing that all together. I'm like a dab princess, you know, where it's like I go and my homegirls set it up for me, and,
Right.
and I'm just gonna take the hit. But I do dabble in dabs. I have a lot of respect for the dabbing community. Those are a shopper that they're in and out. Those dabbers, they're like, this is what I want, this is what I need, and out, what's on sale, I'll see you later. I'm like, bye.
That's funny. We had a question from Loki Terps in the chat. They asked, this is about your work as a writer. They asked, do you have any pieces or plan on having any pieces that are regarding the big business that are trying to take over the industry? Yeah, or maybe if you don't, maybe it's just some thoughts if you want to riff on that.
Sure. Yeah, it's such a big thought, right? Like that is the reality of California cannabis, and a lot of cannabis going, you know, they say adult use rather than recreational, right? But I have not written any pieces on it because it's difficult, right? And there's somebody, his name is Daniel Montero, and he's GW Smoke Break, and he writes a lot about this stuff, and I really appreciate his perspective on it because it's this weird balance, right? Where like corporate cannabis is this big evil monster part of it, right? But I also have been a part of corporate cannabis and I've benefited from corporate cannabis. And there is a need for, you know, HR and structure and, you know, people getting paid on time and getting paid, you know, accordingly. But then there is also this heavy battle of a lot of growers, some of who I connect with online, you know, that are being pushed out, that have been, you know, legacy growers forever and have, it's crazy, right? Because they're the reason why we have legal cannabis in the first place. They've been growing it. They've had these farms for decades. So I think it's just like a tricky topic, especially because, you know, adult use means access for people, right? Like it means that there are dispensaries that everybody can feel safe walking in and out of. And you do have product that's tested, and, you know, testing of products is a whole nother beast of a topic on, you know, the validity of that and what that means as far as numbers and consumption. So I haven't tackled it because it's hard, but there are a lot of, you know, like I said, Daniel's a great resource that I kind of like tap into to connect with growers, because I think that that's the least I can do, is at least hear them, listen to them. And then I try to find out where I can find their product too. Like if there's a brand that I connect with, I'll go out of my way to find a dispensary that sells that specific cultivar, or product, just to support a smaller company, and then use my platform to the best of my ability to promote them. So Yeah, corporate cannabis is a chunky topic.
Yeah. No, I know who you're talking about. I like I've met him a couple times, and Daniel, he works for what is it, Redwood Roots, which is a distributor, and they distribute Huckleberry Hill Farms, and
Yes.
all their stuff. Yeah, like you were saying, I can't get it in Vallejo because none of the dispensaries sell it, but there's dispensaries in there's Seven Stars over in El Cerrito, Richmond area, and then there's one up in Fairfield. So I have to drive, 20 minutes or so, but it's definitely worth it if you care about the growers, and you want to make sure that those people are supported so that they stick around. You know what I mean? Because we can like all this stuff we want, but if people aren't buying their stuff and telling their friends about it, then they're not going to be here.
And it's crazy. People, I think, sometimes really I mean, I shouldn't say people, but sometimes I feel like the importance of the retail space and of bud tenders can get really lost in the sauce. But then in those moments where you're like, where did this brand go? Why haven't I seen them? And why can't I find them? It's like, well, it's because people stopped asking about them and people stopped shopping for them. And so, you know, there's the retail space, the shelf space is very, very competitive. So yeah, I always will drive. Like I like to go to Rosemary Jane in Oakland. They carry a lot of equity brands, woman-owned brands, minority-owned brands. So yeah, it's important where we shop and you know, supporting retailers that give shelf space to small farmers is really important as
Exactly.
well, you know?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Definitely shop around because sometimes dispensaries are more cool than others. Some of the dispensaries, they love all the outdoor grown and are like all out about it. And then, others, they're like trying to get you to buy the indoor or whatever, whatever your
That
vibe is.
that kind of was leading into my question, kind of leading into some of your bud tending experience. You were probably a bud tender when they were really trying to rebrand Sungrown, was kind of like the branding Sungrown.
Mhm.
How's that kind of movement going, and is it still a thing or is it not?
I would like to think it's still very much a thing. And I was blessed to work with a lovely woman named Murphy, who was like my mentor and trained me in pretty much like everything I know. You know, a bulk of my education came from her, and she was really big on sun-grown, outdoor, small farm-based cannabis. And um, I spent a lot of my bud tending really not battling people, but like I definitely would, you know, try and get the conversation started is the best way to put it, which
Yeah,
is, you know, and that's why, you know, brands it's crazy because outdoor flower tends to be less expensive, right? So that was kind of always like it's unfortunate, but that was always like my in that conversation. And then having, you know, having to shift it from, okay, price point doesn't always equal quality, right? And what is and I always tell people, I'm like, you're in California. If you're gonna think about any place to grow outdoor weed, California is kind of like one of the better ones. And if you think about organic agriculture and quality of soil and grow, this is one of the best places in the world to grow things. So the conversation is there, and there. I'm hoping that it's still, you know, bubbling and still kind of got some momentum. There was that time in article in the LA Times about clean weed, right? And
Yeah.
it kind of talked about, you know, California's kind of bougie that way, where it's like everything's organic and everything's clean. So there were customers that would start to come in and they were like, I want something, whether it be local or outdoor or organic or you know, a lot of people were starting to come in and wanting lower THC percentages. So I think that as long as bud tenders and influencers and, you know, anybody with a voice in the cannabis space is willing to vouch for the quality of outdoor sun-grown California cannabis, I think customers will eventually follow suit. Because um, when it comes to weed, word of mouth is really kind of like the end all be all, because it's so subjective, right? Like we can all smoke the same, you know, OG Kush and feel three different ways. But if, you know, I'm more likely to purchase it if you told me like, hey, that OG Kush from, you know, Huckleberry, you know, Farms
Yeah.
is amazing. So yeah, I think the conversation's there. I think customers are, you know, and I think they're starting to realize, just like we've kind of realized all corporate establishments aren't the greatest. So it's important, people are starting to kind of care. And I think they're starting to hear the murmurs of people are really struggling to be successful entrepreneurs in this space. So I hope and I believe that the conversation will continue with customers and bud tenders.
So
Well, oops, sorry, go ahead,
uh,
JR.
did you see people buying more for quality as they got educated, or were they pretty much stuck on that price point?
In the space where I was in, I worked in the South Bay. Price point was really, that was kind of, it's all reflective of the community, right? And in the dispensary that I was in, it's not in, I mean, San Jose is, there are people with lots of money, but a lot of my regular customers were on like, it's bang for buck, right? What's the best value I can get? And a lot of the times that means high THC and price point. Those were the regulars, but there's, the customer demographic is so wild, because then you have customers that are coming in, and there used to be a guy that came in and was like, I'll take an ounce of 8, or you know what I mean, whatever you recommend. And it didn't matter price point. So there was time to be like, okay, like I'll get you this one indoor that I know I really love. I'm going to throw in some brands that I want to support on this end. So I think people are starting to come in and asking for it more. And it's more for price point, but there definitely is conversation about quality of the flower as well.
Yeah. Well, let's keep diving into the bud tender experience. And one of the things that I think I've seen you post about is how challenging of a role it is, because you're like, and sorry for my dogs if you can hear them in the background. It's such a challenging role because you're like part pharmacist, part bartender, part just like retail cashier, at a retail, any sort of retail place. Yeah, so you're just like all this stuff, and I feel like it's such a hard relationship for everyone involved, because I might be coming in with like really high expectations, and then you just have to like be on your feet and have a good suggestion like right there, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a very complex role, and I have a lot of strong opinions about the role of a bud tender and the flack that they catch from every which direction. And I say that I really don't believe that there's bad bud tenders. I think that, like, to your point, I think people come in with expectations, and I think that sometimes there's this narrative, well, bud tenders don't know anything. And I'm like, okay, well, most dispensaries don't invest in training them before they hit the floor. So that's, right? Like it's like any job in a sense, where if you don't give anybody the proper tools that they need to be successful on the floor, they're not going to do well. I was terrified my first day on the floor by myself, and it was Green Wednesday, also known as the day before Thanksgiving, one of the biggest cannabis holidays in the retail space. It actually surpassed, the year I worked it surpassed sales for 420. So it's terrifying, and you have hundreds of products that you have to be able to know right off the bat. And if you don't know, you are looked at as dumb, stupid, or bad bud tender, or maybe, and that's just one aspect of maybe not knowing the answer to the question. You throw in the fact of maybe you're younger than the person that you're helping. Maybe they don't. I've had some of my coworkers tell me that because they were female, somebody didn't want to be helped by them because they thought that she was a girl, so she didn't know as much as somebody else, which, by the way, that girl is one of the most knowledgeable bud tenders I've ever come across. But there's a lot of barriers, and it kind of is frustrating, because I'm like, what makes a good bud tender, right? Because people are always like, well, they're product pushers. And a point that my friend made the other day was, no bud tender is getting paid on commission. So being a product pusher, maybe not so much. Do I have sales incentives? Of course, as every retailer does, right? But that's the reality of a retail space. And it's a weird line you have to walk of, I stopped participating in sales incentives because I decided it went against my values as a bud tender. But I had to decide that for myself, and not all bud tenders operate like that. Sometimes, if you're going to win like a free eighth for selling 10 of these other eighths, that's enough. You know, weed is expensive, and that's a perk of the job. So it's kind of, it's very complex, because then you're also a pharmacist, and how much am I supposed to take, and you're talking to people, and it's one of those jobs too. I get really excited, sorry, but it's like you could be talking to someone, and I could be talking to you, and you'd be shooting, you know, the shit about, you know, like, oh, you know, I just want to get super lit, give me the stoniest eighth you have. And the next person in line, without pause, is somebody that's like, I'm going through chemo, and you know, I need a product that's not going to interfere with these medications. And I've had some very deep, you know, connections with people through the counter, and it's, you know, and I have to turn around, and then, you know, the next person's irate with me because, you know, they had to wait in line an extra, you know, extra long because I took along with this other customer. And, you know, it's it's also a scary place too. Like, you throw in safety as well. I had a friend who their dispensary was just broken into up in San Francisco, and that's a reality of being a bud tender too. There have been bud tenders that have been held up at gunpoint, and that, you know, all for the low price of minimum wage most of the time, you know. So I think that's why I feel so passionately about really believing that all bud tenders want the best for the experience. And I don't like to really like say that, you know, bud tender, you know, and I've gone to dispensaries where, like, you know, my expectations were high, and I was like, okay, like, that bud tender maybe wasn't as knowledgeable, but I would never make them feel less than. I'd just be like, okay, like, thank you, you know. And most of the time at this point in my career, I know enough to kind of navigate the dispensary by myself. A lot of times I just chat with bud tenders now just to chat.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a complex role.
For sure, for sure.
So
We
on
had
a lighter side, have you had customers come in after edible experiences and and kind of like be like, what the hell?
Yeah, I've had, you know, people come back with all types of stories. Like, they have definitely been like, 10 milligrams is way too much for me. Like, I can't,
Yeah.
like, it's, you know, but there's also like, you know, I had a guy and he wanted something for like intimate time with his girlfriend. So I recommended a strain. There's probably some cake variation, because that's usually my go-to for that, you know, activity. But he came back and he's like, oh man, my girl she was too stoned and she fell asleep. And I was like, oh. He's like, yeah, I rolled a blunt for her and she never smokes. I'm like, why would you give her a blunt? Like, that's such a bad idea. Like, there's a lot of fun. I had one time a couple came in and they were playing this game where like, they're like, you fill these bags with whatever edibles, and then we're just going to guess which ones we're going to like pull out. And we have to like guess the flavor and the dosage. I'm like, oh, that sounds like fun. Good luck with that. So, and then, you know, I've had customers come in. One of my favorite customer like recommendations was he was using Kiva chocolates to do chocolate covered strawberries. Genius. Yeah, customers I love them. That's something I miss. You know, getting to talk to them all day, every day about, you know, the ins and outs of how they're infusing their life.
That's cool. We had a question from Ben Ganja, who also said that they just joined CannaBuzz like earlier today. So shout out, Ben. They asked you if you've ever received any advice from anyone in the industry or in this space that, yeah, you could share. I guess, is there any advice, maybe even in the bud tending space or otherwise, that comes to mind?
One of my favorite pieces of advice, and it wasn't necessarily like advice, it was just something to think about, was from a conversation I had with they're under the name Total Flowerhead. And it was that it's important to focus on brands that do more good than harm, because it can be really easy to say like a cannabis brand, you know, doesn't, you know, it's really hard to like give back and be organic and be vegan. And, you know, it's hard to do all those things in this space. So that was something that really sticks with me as I do product reviews, as I, you know, connect with different brands and different people throughout the industry. And then as far as like, you know, being a bud tender, I think it wasn't necessarily advice, but I was really blessed to have someone that was really focused on education and always kind of encouraged asking questions and learning, and always being okay to say like, I don't know the answer. And I think about that a lot. You know, I thought about it a lot when I was bud tending, and as I continue to write and kind of, you know, learn that cannabis has been around a lot longer than all of us. So it's kind of impossible to know it all. And there's a lot of respect in this industry for saying, I don't know the answer to that. And to just, really kind of be delusional in the fact that you can really do whatever you want in this space. I think that, cannabis education on its own and cannabis on its own is a very difficult space to work in, period. And I just continue to believe that there's a space for me there. And that kind of drives a lot of what I do.
JR, did you want to jump in?
One of the trends I'm noticing amongst some of the brands in California is they're trying to lessen their water footprint by capturing all their evaporation and then all the water from their dehumidifiers, bringing it back into the system. Is that something you're aware of or can maybe speak on?
Yeah, Pure Beauty does that, I believe. And that's one of my favorite brands. It's also a Latina-based brand. And they are an indoor flower brand that I always say, I'm like, doing more good than harm, and reducing water footprint is one of them. They did that, and I believe, what was the other one? Was it a Golden State? I think they did something along those lines as well, or like reducing their water. So yeah, that is something that I think is chatter amongst brands and amongst budtenders, but I don't think consumers have kind of really like tapped into the importance of that. And I always say with the, California is continuously in this drought, right? Like that's really important because cannabis uses a lot of water. So brands like that are really important and I always support them. But yeah, it's definitely something that I'm aware of, and I wish that it was more like upfront. Like sometimes I'm like, I wish the jars would say it all. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like every piece of information. Because I think THC is great, but I think as we learn more about it, it's going to become one of those numbers that's kind of like, oh, okay. It's like calories, right? Like sometimes you care, but sometimes you're like, whatever, I'm gonna smoke it. So I wish that more companies would put it like really clear on their packaging because it's more important than I think they think for consumers.
For sure.
I would agree with that 100%. I'm up here in Oregon and, I'm in the northern part where we don't have drought, but everywhere else around me is really crunchy and really on fire.
Yeah, it's scary.
I was another company that came to mind in the Bay Area, since we've been chatting so much about the Bay Area, is they just opened their grow. It's Flora Flame, I think is his name on Instagram, but it's a indoor completely organic grow using like raised beds and no-till organic growing and all that kind of stuff. I'm gonna try to link up with him at some point because I want to chat and learn more about that. But I guess where I'm going with that too is like, look out at the companies that are out there and get to know people's stories. I mean, that's part of the reason why I like Huckleberry Hill Farms so much, is I know the guy's story and it's something that I want to support. And it's not just another jar on the shelf that has some weed in it. You know what I mean? It's like a story and a person that I really want to support and help.
Yeah, I always, when I did work in the retail space, it was kind of like my annoying, like, what do they call it? Squeaky wheel thing, where I was like, stories matter very much in cannabis. They matter so much. And those are the brands that I do connect with most often are either, people that, were once budtenders. And I always feel really inspired when I see them, now in the, creating a product that's on the shelf, or people that have been legacy growers. Bryceland Family Farms, I did a piece for chemistry on them, and they were another great legacy farming brand. Yeah. What strain do you have from them?
This was, what was this? This was Morning Cuddle was its name.
Damn, their mother's milk apparently had terps that were like 3%, which in terp percentages is like a really high percentage. So I've been looking for some mother's milk from them because that's one of my favorites.
Yeah, I'm putting it on the stream now, but they have this really cool jar. It was like this kind of little mini mason jar with an, I think it looks like it's recycled plastic lid,
Nice.
But it's just another one of those things too with these smaller growers. They'll go out of their way, because I'm sure this jar is not cheap to put their weed in, you know what I mean? But it's cool too when these growers, they really care about that end of things too. They don't want to just put their weed in a Mylar bag that's just gonna be in the ocean.
Bags.
You know what I mean?
So much. I hate those bags so much. I know that they're cheap, but you could go literally on the internet right now and buy, like, I knew somebody that just went and bought ones that said Wonder Bread on them. And I'm like,
Yeah.
that's not Wonder Bread that's in that bag, friend. And they're like, I know.
Yeah, you can get them on like Amazon, and you can even get them at smoke shops. Like here in Vallejo, you can just go into smoke shops and you can just buy stacks of Mylars that say, cookies on it or whatever.
It's so
Um,
sad.
So
we
kind of
ha-
going back to that question of branding versus marketing, can you kind of speak to maybe what the differences between those two are a little bit?
I think in the context of cannabis, branding, I think it is more of the story, right? Like telling where you're from and who you guys are as a brand and what your goal is. Where marketing, I think a lot of times is like THC percentage and flashy Mylar bags and fun, funky renaming of strains or cultivars, whatever you want to call it, that don't need to be renamed. The renaming of products really drives me insane. Somebody that cares about education and knowing the lineage of different cultivars. But yeah, I think that branding is definitely more of the storytelling and really connecting with the cannabis consumer. I think that the cannabis space is still so new and fresh, where brands are so close to their consumer and you can reach out to them on social media. I always tell people if they had an issue with a product, I'm like, I would hit them up on Twitter or Instagram, because they're more likely to care that you're saying it. They don't really care that the retail space is saying, X, Y, or Z. They care that you're going to go and share that information. Because like I kind of reiterate what I was saying, like word of mouth in this industry can be detrimental. If you get a bad reputation, I've seen brands like really like fall off menus because of bad reputations.
right.
Yeah, it can happen, especially like I deal with a lot of breeders. And so the breeder community, I mean, you can really
A lot of
lose it.
drama.
Yeah. Oh, not only just a lot of drama, but I mean, you make a false move and you put out a product that maybe herms on everyone. All of a sudden you're the herm king and you can't sell any of your genetics anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like, in that cannabis space, it seems like you have to be, very about what you do. Otherwise, sometimes it can really come back to haunt you.
Yeah. And those reputations stick for a long time.
Yes, for a
you
reason.
yeah.
I think our community is very passionate about the plant. And so we don't really tolerate a lot of BS, you know what I mean? Because there's a lot of people who do things and not necessarily, like you said, the best story to tell. And so I think it's important, like you said, that we find out the stories of the brands that we're a part of and make those kind of moves accordingly.
Yeah, I always say cannabis is very personal. I had, that's something I would get a lot is like, will you take things too personal? Like cannabis is personal, right? Like it is like cannabis. Most of us are here because it helps with something in our life, whether that be relaxing or sleeping or anxiety or pain or depression. And yeah, people care, and this community, a lot of us, like I would say 90% of us, have up until recently had to defend our cannabis usage and our love for cannabis and our belief in cannabis. And so I do take it personal now when I see, a whole bunch of celebrity brands just throwing their name on OG Kush because OG Kush is always good. I'm not the kind of like consumer that gets hyped on that. I really get hyped on helping the people that have helped develop this industry.
Totally. We had a question earlier. You were talking about strain names and stuff like that. So we had a question from Loki Terps in the chat. They asked about the negative impact on the industry when people name strains after hard drugs. So there's like green crack is like the one that immediately jumps to mind, but there's LSD and there's all kinds of stuff that you'll see up on the menu sign. Yeah, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think people are trying to like attention grab because there are, and sometimes I'm guilty of it as well, like shopping based off a strain name. But yeah, I do think it's probably not the best, especially because people associate the name with effects and flavors, regardless of if that is true, right? Like, you know, people would ask, like banana strains, for example, right? A lot of people ask, like, well, does it smell like banana? And if it has banana OG lineage, then yes, it should. Depending on what the other cross is, have some sort of like hints of sweet fruit. But if somebody else is just naming, you know, a strain, you know, wild bananas because they can, it's just, it doesn't do any real justice other than like, you know. But yeah, naming them after drugs and hardcore drugs, I definitely think is probably not good for the overall image. And I don't think a lot of, you know, cultivars have been named that like on their own, like kind of in history of cultivars. Like that's something definitely new I've seen as cannabis has, you know, become more of like an open retail, you know, space.
Right.
And now, as a female, how do you feel about some of the strain names that are kind of like the kind one might be panty dropper or some, you know, they've got some
Bootylicious. Yeah, that's one.
Yeah, I've seen all kinds. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I really just think they should be named, you know, it doesn't do any sort of good, right? Like the over sexualization of women in cannabis isn't really cool, because that's not, I mean, I think, you know, I'm all about doing whatever you want, and like I'm, you know, pro that, you know, if you want to be sexual, if you want to be not sexual, it's all gravy. But I don't think like, you know, putting it on cannabis where it's supposed to be much more of like a universal for everybody type space, I think you definitely like exile some demographics that way. And I just believe, just name it what it is. If it's a wedding cake strain, what's wrong with it being wedding cake strain? I think a lot of people would be embarrassed with how many, you know. And I did talk to he wasn't a grower, like a kind of, he started the seeds. What are those people called? Yeah, like a nursery.
Breeder. Yeah.
Yeah, like a breeder. Yeah, like, and he was saying like, you know, back in the day, it was hard to get the same strain everywhere, and now everybody's growing, you know, 8 different gelato strains, you know, like, and everybody has a gelato, and they have to rename it, because if there's, you know, if you have 2 gelatos on the shelf and they're both testing at 35% THC, but one's $20 and the other one's 65, you know, you have to find a way to kind of differentiate yourself. But I think if people kind of got back to the roots of caring what they're growing and growing what they want to grow because they believe that that's a good strain or a cultivar, you know, regardless of what the market is saying, we wouldn't necessarily have such a, you know, what's the word, saturated market of all gelatos and cookies.
Yeah. Yeah, we getting comments and chat about, you know, Honey Smith said it's about the terps and the cannabinoids, not the names. Names don't mean anything. I totally get that, and I agree that names don't really mean anything. But unfortunately, they're there and they're part of the experience, right? And people are going to still pick based on it. And also, I don't think, and maybe we could talk about this for a second too, in terms of like how to kind of improve the experience, or maybe if you have some thoughts on that. Because like, you know, in an ideal world, I guess I could go into a dispensary and I could say, maybe I could list some strains that I've liked in the past, and that, you know, the budtender would magically know what the terpene profile of that is, and then kind of give some recommendations. Or maybe I knew the terpenes that I like, you know, that would be a perfect world. But even if I know the strains that I like, I sometimes get recommendations that are like totally off the wall that I don't feel like really fit in with that. So I just don't feel like we're really there. Maybe that's like a little bit of a rant there, but I just feel like we're not really there yet where we're able to kind of like truly match you with the strain or whatever that could help you, where you could just be totally blind to like names and percentages and stuff like that. But I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? How could we like better match people up with weed rather than going off of the cool name and what's like going to get me the highest for the least amount of money, you know?
We could all be on the same page. I feel like cannabis consumers, cannabis marketing, and cannabis science are on 3 different pages. And I stand by that, because here's my, you know, I had to stop fighting with people, because I was like a terp snob, you know, when I first learned about terps and the importance of them. And as I've kind of, because you can't be like that all the time in a retail space. And I really had to refine that attitude. And also realize that, like, because then I started to be challenged, right? Like people would be like, okay, well, I do want something that's high in terpinolene and has myrcene in it and caryophyllene. And then I was like, oh shoot, like I have to go and do my own research, you know, because there are very few brands that list the top terps on their flower, right? Like that's, and there are few, I shouldn't say few, there are select brands that even test for terps, because testing for terps costs money, and testing costs money, period. So some brands don't have the means to, you know, extend their testing to terpenes. And then you think, you know, about the validity of testing and how things can be skewed and maybe not always the best representation, and you're testing one batch and not every single nug, and if that nug comes from a different part of the plant that got maybe more or less light, or you know,
Right.
more or less water, and that could affect the profile. So I could rant about this for days, because I would love to say, like, I would love for you to walk in and be like, Becca, I want, you know, a Jack Herrera that's got 3% terps and it's rich in limonene and terpinolene, and I'd be like, perfect, I have this one right here for you, you know, and it'd be like a little like computer, and it would just like pop out.
Yeah, I was gonna say AI will take care of all of that for us.
Yeah, for some reason I was
Right?
thinking of like Rosie from the Jetsons, or maybe the or the robot from Pee-wee's Playhouse, where they just like spit out a thing.
Exactly.
So
But
my next, oh, sorry, my next question is, when you see these like dispensary results, like I see advertisements on Instagram about dispensaries in Oklahoma, 46%. And so when you see those numbers like 40, and I mean, you know, can you kind of, how does that make you feel?
I definitely look at it like, okay, because and one of my managers had brought up this point to me. They're like, well, if that you're talking your plant is like almost 50% THC, you know, like what are the odds that that's actually really true? And also most of the time I think, well, if you're that high in THC, a lot of times you're lacking in other cannabinoids, right? And I feel like the kind of the best way, and at least from like the feedback I got from like customers, as well as you know, people that I worked with, is that a lot of times when you are getting those high THC numbers, like, yeah, you'll get super high, like right off the bat. It's almost like hitting like a vape pen, right? Like you're like, oh, I'm gonna rip this, and I get super lit. And then it kind of like tapers off, and you're kind of like, well, I need to get high again, because that lasted like 20 minutes. So that's kind of something I always think about when I do see high numbers, is that like, well, how does that feel? You know what I mean? Like, yeah, you're 40% THC, but is it good though? Like, or did you just worry about getting something that high? And also, like, who tested it, and are you like, how close are you with that testing company, and what role did that play in that insane number? Because especially in California, they base prices off of THC percentage. So I know that it's like sometimes like a scam, you know, like I'm like, you're really banking on the fact that people care that much about that content that they're willing to spend $20, $30, $40 more, when a lot of the times there's a product, you know, if not better, for, you know, maybe even the same price, that, you know, maybe lower in THC, that doesn't get enough love. So yeah, those numbers are, I try not to look at them that much, but I get it.
Well,
people like them.
I know that, like, I think it has a lot to do with what you said in the beginning. Kind of like, if I was to hold up a bong hit, you're going to tell me that 48% of that bong hit is the molecule THC delta 9. I mean, I don't know how they actually do testing, but that, I mean, like you said, the science isn't quite matching the marketing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and they'll find any reason to charge people more for cannabis. And I would always joke to people that I don't believe in paying full price for cannabis in this abundant state, because this state produces 4 times as much weed than we can consume, which means that a lot of people are losing money. So I think that there's brands that are worth those price points for sure sometimes, but I always try and like, yeah, I just take it with a grain of salt, the numbers and the marketing of it and the price points of it. And I just focus on like people that I know are doing good, because that's really the only thing that I can control when it comes to like consumption. You know, everything else is so unbelievably subjective. And that's kind of what I continue to have validated as I continue researching and diving in deeper to topics, is how we really don't know. Like we have a general idea of how this is affecting our body and our endocannabinoid system, but our endocannabinoid systems are like a thumbprint, right? Like they're so unique to us and whatever else is going on in our body at the time. And, you know, even consuming the same cultivar, you know, 3 different times in your day may feel different. So, yeah, I try to focus on just cool brands and brands that I vibe with.
Totally.
So in the Bay Area, do you guys still have those pop-ups where they'll just throw up a table and start slinging?
Yeah, the farmers markets. And you know what's crazy is they actually started legitimate, I shouldn't say legitimate, but they have the more like local kind of like community-based farmers markets are definitely like you know, underground vibe because you know of that. But yeah, they're definitely still around. And but in Humboldt they actually legalized having cannabis at their farmers markets, and they do it twice. They did it in July, and I think they're doing it again in October or this month or next month, where you can drive up there and like literally buy your weed straight from the farmer. So
Awesome.
Fantastic.
yeah,
That's
so
really
that's
cool.
That's awesome.
and that's what I feel like is the vibe. Like I feel like that would be the best place. I hope that it's other places besides Humboldt as that kind of becomes more normalized, but that's just an amazing experience to really just get it from the farmers. That's what people want anyways. A lot of times people don't, because a lot of times people don't want like just an eighth, right? And they're always like, well, do I have to buy like 8 jars of these, you know?
Yeah,
I mean?
exactly.
Like, I'm sorry, but you have to, because I don't have anything in an ounce.
Right.
So hopefully that'll kind of become more normal.
Well, so we just went past 7, and so we like to be respectful of everyone's time. So we really appreciate your time tonight. We had a question from Ben before you go, and they asked, do you have a preferred method of contact for business inquiries or just general contact? So how can people get a hold of you?
Instagram is really where I'm the most active, and I am at that cannabis writer. I usually try to respond to everybody in a timely manner, depending on the topic, as long as it's appropriate. But yeah, that's where people can reach me, and I try to answer questions to the best of my ability and or send you to an appropriate resource.
And your tag is that cannabis writer, all one
Yeah.
word.
Yes.
Awesome.
Both me and Q have made posts, and we've tagged you in it. So if if they can't find you, they can find you through us.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Find JR, Q Grows, or the CannaBuzz account on Instagram. We've all tagged Rebecca's account. We've got a bunch of emojis in the chat. Keep hitting the emojis if you're watching this live. We love to know that you're there. So awesome. Anything else that you want to plug before we let you go? Like anything you want to shout out or anything?
No, I think I've shouted out everybody that I love so dearly already. They're very much
Cool.
part of my vibe, and I really appreciate you guys even wanting to chat with me about things like being a budtender. I'm always amazed at how much people want to know about it. So I am on TikTok as well, and I do talk more about being a budtender there, and I'm also that cannabis writer there. So
Awesome.
I'll continue to share whatever you guys want to know.
Are you going to go to the Emerald Cup in December?
I went last year and it was such a vibe, and I do plan on stopping by maybe for a little bit. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, maybe I'll see you there. I plan to be there, and we're going to try to get JR down from Oregon.
Yeah.
So if we can get all the, yeah, we're going to try. But I'll definitely be there. And well, awesome. Let's see. Dollar Bill said, bang an interview. Dothraki 420 said, wealth of knowledge, great information. Thank you. So a lot of love in the chat for you. So
thank you. Oh, that's so sweet. I love that.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. If you're watching this live, we really appreciate you guys for hanging out with us tonight. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe and like and tell all your friends and all the good stuff. And make sure to follow Rebecca on Instagram and on TikTok. It's at that cannabis writer, right? I got it.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes.
Well, awesome, everyone. Thanks, everyone, and have a great night.
Growers love.